I just want to finish on a couple of practical tips that you might have for people doing history specifically. Obviously, you got a state rank in both of those histories, modern and ancient. So we'd love to know what you were doing exactly in the few weeks before the HSC. Let's just use that as an example. And then I'm sure that applies to a similar extent for trials. Before the HSC, what were you doing in terms of past papers? You talked about syllabus dot points and having this big doc, but I would love to know more about those essay plans, what's actually in them, how thorough are they, how much will you memorize in, anything on that would be super helpful.
Yeah, so in the lead up to the trials in HSC, there were, I'll be honest, it was a lot of memory work. So for modern and ancient, for the essay subjects, I had essay plans for just about as many questions as you could think of. And some of them even inconceivable, like ones for like really specific dot points, which you don't think they would ever ask for unless they were being really mean that year. And then, so I had those which usually had the, 4 paragraphs or whatever, usually no introduction, because for history, introductions are fairly standard. And then I'd have my topic sentence, and then whatever statistics, quotes, facts, and maybe a bit of like a like content note if I needed it. But always generally in terms of my paragraph structure, I would have, made it so it flowed in my head in terms of what I was writing. And then, so I had that on a doc, and what I was doing was essentially I would go from the top of the doc and I would look at the question and I'd try and write out a paragraph. Not write out, sorry, like write out the dot points of the paragraph with the statistics, quotes, facts, dates. And then I would scroll down. If I'd forgot something or missed a quote, missed a statistic, I'd add that in. And then I'd do the next paragraph and I'd just go down the doc and then down the doc and then down the doc until it was all up there. And then for the non-essay part of it, for short answers, firstly, I did a ton of practice responses throughout the year. I remember once actually feeling guilty as I pressed send on the practice response button to one of my history teachers. But in the direct lead up, I think by that point, I'd done so many practice responses that I was doing fewer, which may have been may have been a miscalculation. I'm not sure. Wow. It didn't, obviously it didn't.
I was going to say.
Yeah, it didn't harm me too much. But by that point, I was also doing I set up some Quizlet sets with dates and statistics and quotes. And I was going through those because I found that I didn't feel it necessary to memorize a short answer question, like a 5 marker, a 10 marker. I didn't feel it as necessary to memorize the exact structure of that. So I always trusted myself to be able to respond and pull the facts out of my brain. And so these were pretty bulky sets with usually essentially that whole subject essentially, but condensed into, the really important bits. And then I had a chance to do some, mock papers at my school, which I enjoyed doing. And I put myself through the ring of fire after trials and before the HSC, which was in 5 days. I did 8 HSC exams under timed conditions and got them all marked by teachers. Wow. Which I remember at the end of that thinking, now the HSC is going to be really easy, because that was actually, terrible. Never do 2-3 hour papers in a day. But I'm not sure about maths, but don't do it for I did history and Latin in one day, and by the end of it, I think my hand was giving up, but it was very strong. It was very strong, and I never had tired hands during the HSC. So yeah, I know people who got away with doing a lot less work than I did, who still did reasonably well, but in the end, that was more so, I think, in terms that was luck in many ways, because you never know what the questions are going to be. And interestingly enough, in my modern exam I did conflict in Europe for one of my essays, and both the questions last year were incredibly broad. It was basically choose your own adventure of questions. And I remember at the end of it feeling a bit disappointed in the sense that you didn't actually need to know as much detail as I knew about the entire syllabus. Like you could have gone in with a lot less, as I know my friends did, and write really good essays because they were just that broad. But you never know if that's going to be the case, because on the flip side, it could be a hyper specific question like about gulags or something if you were doing Russia, which no one would be prepared for. So yeah, I'd say practicing the boring stuff, so getting it all memorized, and then also make sure you have the proper skills going in, because outside of all the memorizing and having all the statistics and, you know, thousands of whatever in your head, it will be important that you know how to respond on the day. And so you've done the practice responses in advance, you've gotten feedback on how you write them, and the more you do, the higher chance is you're going to encounter something the same in your exam. For example, for me, in my mock exam, actually, I did, there was one of the questions in the China section that I studied was about the Red Guards, and I wrote it in a certain way, submitted it, and I got feedback. And that was one of the few places where I lost marks in that mock. And the teacher wrote just a note saying, you know, this was about the role of the Red Guard. You've described what they've done, but you haven't talked specifically about their role. And I sat down on my HSC exam, I opened up the China section, and what was one of the main questions? What was the role of the Red Guards? And so I just was able to immediately, my brain just flashed back to that, and I thought, oh, here we go, easy. So because there is, you know, as wide and as much content as there are still syllabus points, and the question's always going to be linked to them. So if you do a wide variety of questions, and you have the requisite content knowledge, the requisite skills which you've just worked up over the whole year, you will be in a good place.